Before we look at the actual principles of education and guidance with a little bit of an overview and touching upon some details of each chapter and perhaps bringing it into contemporary expression, I just want to mention, generally speaking, after that fascinating presentation by Professor Chazan, and Professor Wexler, and Dr. Lowenthal, I just want to mention that in the Kabbalah and in Hasidus, we speak about all the Sefirot, and we speak about all communication in terms of Or and Keli, radiance and the vessel. In terms of language, it is an idea which I want to communicate, or there's an emotion I want to communicate, and the vessel is how I'm going to give it over, how I'm going to be able to be effective with it. And the same thing applies internally. Within each person, we have to find that internal language which is going to be able to communicate a specific concept to the person that we want to tell, or we want to impress, or we want to alert. And paradoxically, the vessel reveals what the radiance wants to say by concealing it. The function of the vessel, in other words, if a person is thinking and you want to communicate your thoughts, you use speech. Speech reveals the thoughts, and it does it by downsizing it, as we saw before in the example from the fourth part of Tanya, chapter 15. So you want to give over something very intense, you have to find the language. If you find the language, there's an inverse proportionality over here, because the idea is going to become watered down through the language, possibly. And that is the process of chinuch, is being able to communicate. This is my understanding, generally, of the principles of education and guidance. It's having something very intense and beautiful and powerful to communicate, and having to find the language which will be able to communicate it at the same time as not diminishing the intensity of the thought that we want to communicate. And it was specifically relevant in the last 3 generations of Chabad leadership. The 5th Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Dabaz, we heard before that he communicated the idea in 1848. We'll come back to that after we do the actual overview. And the generation of his son and successor, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, and the generation of our Rebbe, the 7th Rebbe, who brought these thoughts to the global dimension well before the expression global village was even coined. When I teach this subject, I'm the headmaster of the school, but this subject I teach to 17-year-old girls once a week, every year. And when I teach it to them, I tell them, they say, what if we're not going to be educators? I say, education is communication. You're going to be a parent. You're going to be a wife. You're going to go into a shop. You're going to go onto a bus. Every single communication, every single interaction between 2 people is education. And the way you prepare yourself and understanding the importance of the correct language, the correct keli, the correct vessel, is crucial in any relationship that there is in the world. So let's look at the principles of education and guidance. And I'm doing it just a few chapters at a time. I've broken it down into about 8 different, there are 17 chapters. And I believe that of those 17 chapters, you can say that 12 or 13 are talking about the importance of the vessel, the importance of understanding and being sensitive to the recipient, and to be sensitive to one's own self, which is particularly relevant in the current generations where there's such change and such turmoil every few years. There's the whole idea of future shock and being able to have something to say without diluting the message. Chapters 1 and 2, in this edition, it's from page 20 through page 26. The Rebbe is telling us that teaching is something which deals with the highest faculties of a person. That in teaching, there are two distinct components. One is imparting knowledge, and one is developing the skills of our pupils. We're trying to give some information and trying to have the pupil able to get their own information. Education is more than just teaching. It's chinuch. Chinuch means training. Chinuch means guidance. And this deals with the lowest parts of the person. In other words, the development of the character of the person. And you have to start with the fact that, as it says in the scripture, a person is born like a wild animal. And it's developing the person, which is the goal of education, as opposed to merely teaching. In teaching, you can say there are three parts. One is teaching, giving knowledge, developing skills, all of that would be called hoiro'ah, malamed, teacher. But education is teaching values. And not only teaching values, but teaching the importance of and motivating the pupil to train their own characters. Because Chabad, at the end of the day, Chabad is the name of the movement, but it also is an acronym for the philosophy, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Wisdom is intuitive knowledge, knowing something. Understanding means evaluating it, seeing its potential, seeing its depth, seeing it horizontally and vertically, all the different implications of it. But the crucial element is das. Dat means applying it. That's knowledge which is applied to the person, that when I understand something, it says in Hasidic discourses that the proof of understanding is the fact that it evokes an emotion. And the proof that the emotion is genuine, is the fact that a person acts upon it. It changes their behavior some way or another. So the goal of education, as opposed just to teaching, is that you're not only transmitting knowledge, but also values and character training. The Klolei HaChinuch VaHadracha, this work of Rabbi Joseph Isaac, is not explicitly referred to in most of the teachings of the Rebbe. In fact, I think there's only one single mention. The Rebbe is the one who gave this out, who published it in 1943. It was written in 1848, but it was not known, it was not published till...
1898.
Oh, I said 48. I'm going by the... 1898, thank you, Dr. Lowenthal.
1848 was the year of revolution. So
Yeah. Okay, 1898 it was written, and 1943 is the year that it was actually published by the Rebbe. The Rebbe refers to it in a letter before he assumed the leadership in 1948. Someone wrote a book on education, and he said, you should have consulted the book by my father-in-law on the principles of education and guidance. However, I believe that every single talk of the Rebbe and every single letter of the Rebbe on education is based on this concept. Even when it's not talking about education, the most esoteric teachings of the Rebbe speak about the concept we heard from Menachem Schmidt of Dira B'Tachtonim, finding a dwelling place for God in the lowest world. And the Rebbe explains that this means knowing the world, being aware of it, and not being afraid of it, not seeing it as an enemy that has to be subdued, but seeing it as an instrument to be able to express the deepest concepts that you understand. That is everywhere in the Rebbe's teachings. In fact, if you look in the index of the Rebbe's teachings, the index of the Rebbe's letters, for example, there are more columns of references. There's a whole volume just of an index to the 35 volumes of the Rebbe's letters. There are more columns on the subject education of chinuch than Torah, than Teshuvah, than Tefillah, than Mashiach, than Geula, than Tanya. Whatever subject you want, I believe it's probably the most. It's certainly one of the most. Similarly, just recently, Rabbi Zellickson gave out an index of all the unedited talks and edited talks, all the talks of the Rebbe, and this is a massive volume. It also has more on education than on almost any other subject, more columns about education. So this is something which the Rebbe very much took as his theme, his mission statement, and it was expressed immediately in practical terms in his relationship with the world, and specifically, as I heard from the Rebbe, that when the function of an educational body is not only to transmit knowledge, which is going to help a person make a living, but something which is going to help a person live their life, which means values. And subsequently, the Rebbe very much was in favor in 1962 of a non-denominational prayer being promoted in schools. Subsequently, that was transmuted to a moment of silence, a moment of reflection, in order to comply with the requirements of separation of church and state, both legally and also practically, not wanting overzealous teachers to promote what they wanted religiously. He said that when the parent sends the child to school, they should send them with a sandwich for lunch, but at the same time also with something to think about when they're going to have that moment of silence. So and then later, the Rebbe promoted very strongly the concept of Shava Mitzvot that we heard before, the Noahide laws, education for all of humankind, that every person should be able to understand and to contemplate. The contemplation itself, that there's a purpose to their life, this in itself is a tremendous educational value for all human beings. And he said this would bring the world to a state of universal peace if everywhere this were promoted. People thought about, in terms of values, my existence is meaningful, and there's a reason that I'm here. That in itself would lead people ultimately to having an harmonious life and being able to interact with each other in a perfect way. And the Rebbe's correspondence with various presidents of the United States, usually in conjunction with his birthday, when he was sent blessings by the presidents of the United States, he would promote an official education day in the United States. To this day, this continues. Next week will be the Rebbe's birthday. That day is normally chosen by Congress to proclaim it as an education day. It's to bring that awareness, and it should filter through the importance of education, as opposed to merely just promoting the arts and the sciences, but value-centered education. Then we go on to chapters 3 and 4. These two chapters, that's on page 26 through 34, these chapters speak about the self-assessment of the educator. In other words, the way I understand it, it means refining yourself, understanding yourself. The educator who understands and who works at facing up to their own deficiencies and their own requirements of how they themselves have to improve their own character will, number one, understand and be sensitive to the central part of education, which is to be able to promote values. Secondly, they will understand how much of a struggle it is to be able to overcome different aspects of a person's life and to be able to be sensitive to where the pupil is at, Where is that keli? Where is that person standing right now that I should be able to communicate it, as we'll see in the subsequent chapters? And thirdly, they will find the right language. They will be able to find the language. I'll tell you a little anecdote. There is a Chabad rabbi called Rabbi Moshe Feller. Disclaimer, he's married to my sister. He is in the upper Midwest. He's in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he was running a Passover Seder with the girls of Machon Chana. That's the school for college trained girls who subsequently come and spend a year or two, and they study in Machon Chana. And they had their own Seder, and he was running. This goes back about, must be about 35 years now. And the Rebbe came to visit the Seders in the yeshivas of the boys. So he also went to Machon Chana, to the girls' public Seder. And Rabbi Feller was there with his little son. He's now a big son, but Menachem Mendel Feller. And at that time his only child, and he was about 9 or 10 years old. And the Rebbe asked the boy, do you know the 4 questions that you ask at the Seder? And the boy said, do you know them by heart? And he said, yes. And then the Rebbe pointed to his father, Rabbi Feller, and he said, does he know the answers? So all the girls laughed. First of all, they never had heard the Rebbe speak in English. All his public talks were given in Yiddish, and they never had seen the Rebbe from so close up. And that was it. The next day, after prayers, it must be about 12, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when the public prayer was over, the Rebbe's secretary, Rabbi Klein, ran up to Rabbi Feller. He said, the Rebbe wants to see you in his room. Very, very rare thing. On the first day of Pesach, and Rabbi Feller ran up, and the Rebbe said, you know, what I said yesterday, it was humorous on one level, but on another level, it was a very serious question. He said, any child of sensitivity would ask himself, I just asked the questions a year ago. So why am I asking the same questions now that I asked 12 months ago? And therefore, I use the English word by heart in Hebrew. When you want to say by heart, or in Yiddish, you say bal peh. That means, is it on your tongue? To say by heart. In English, you say by heart. It's in your heart. He said, is it in your heart? The heart of the question is to understand that this year the questions are not the same. And he just took the opportunity. He said, by the way, Rebbe, today, the first day of Pesach, is my birthday. So the Rebbe said, it's exactly the same question. I give you a blessing for your birthday, but you had a birthday a year ago, and please God, you'll have one next year. The idea is that we have to grow. That's what it's all about. And Rabbi Feller was standing, and then the Rebbe said, Gefinde Oisius auf zu Maßbe sein zu sich, wirst du gefinden der Oisius zu Maßbe sein zu dem Sohn. If you will find a language to explain it to yourself, you will then be able to find a language to explain it to your son. And that's what I'm reminded of when I learned this chapter here in the Principles of Education and Guidance, that when the educator is able to refine themselves, they know the language, they know the concept, they are able to expect, to inspire, to role model what they are teaching their pupils in a way that nothing else could achieve. And then, in chapter 5, it's a key chapter of the whole Klali Chinuch V'Hadracha. Chapter 5 is on pages 34 through 38. That chapter speaks about the care that one must have in being refined, in one's style, in one's approach, to avoid shouting, to avoid insulting, to avoid coming over like in a very authoritative way, an authoritarian way, rather to be able to find the right words and the right language in a polite way, and then it will be effective. Later on in chapter 14, we'll have some more about that, the idea of the language and its effect upon the pupil. But the idea is that when a person looks, I believe you can say that it's saying the teacher should respect the pupil, and then you can be an educator. not when you take them for granted. The Rebbe writes in many places in his letters that the teachers and principals and directors and organizers of educational establishments have to remind themselves that the key personnel are the pupils. And everything has to serve them. And at that moment, you're able to communicate what you wanted to say. I'll tell you a personal anecdote. I was in Yechidus in a private audience with the Rebbe once in 1973, in May, June. It was Shavuos time. And I communicated to the Rebbe in my note, one would write a note to the Rebbe, that I had a serious problem of getting too excited and too angry with my own personal children. We have kind of a large family. And I felt that this is wrong, but sometimes you get very nervous and concerned, and you can lose it with children. I found it more with one's own children sometimes than with pupils. And the Rebbe told me that, I'm paraphrasing, he said, the way of Chabad is through hisbonenus, through contemplation. He said, one of the contemplations which will help you is to think. A contemplation, a hisbonenus, means not just to know. It means to internalize. It means to understand. It's something which comes by drill, by repetition within oneself, an awareness that as much as they are your children, it says in the Torah, Banim atem l'Hashem Elokechem. You are children of God your God. See your children, your own children, as the children of God. And you be careful the way you treat the children of a fellow human. How much more so should you be careful with your treatment of God's children? And he said, sometimes you have to discipline and you have to use strictness, but it should never be out of anger. It should be something which is an instrument which is expressing what's right, never out of anger. So that's how I understand chapter 5. And now we're going to do 7 chapters actually, from chapter 6 through chapter 12. That's page 38 through page 66. Here, the Rebbe Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson is teaching us the importance of the evaluation, of the assessment of our pupils. Number one, what he calls the mahut. What is it? The nature of the person. And the matzav, which means the situation where they are. I explain it to my own students. I say it's who they are and where they are. Who they are, you have to have an expectation which is appropriate to the student's abilities, appropriate to an age appropriate. You cannot feed the same food, and you cannot take the same approach, and he goes into details in chapter 6 about how one has to treat a child one way, a preteen, a teen, and an adult. You have to be able to make sure that the language that we use and the approach that we use is appropriate to that age, and also to what the talents and abilities of that particular pupil is. And then he goes into 4 categories of situation, the matzav, where the pupil is at, according to occupation, according to economic status, according to their habits, and according to their domicile, where they live. According to their the occupation, somebody who is a student, an academic, a scholar, a Yoshev Ohel, it's called in Hebrew. That type of a person has more control over their time, and there are different expectations and different demands that you can make of such a person vis-a-vis someone who is in the world of business and is really tied up to other people much more than a scholar is, and is more involved in the hustle bustle of the world. That must be taken into consideration. The economic situation, you have to realize that rich people are very arrogant by nature. There's some very strong hitting terminology over there about the chutzpah, about the the very comfort of a person who's wealthy vis-a-vis someone who's poor, who is usually broken-hearted and downtrodden, and that has to be taken into consideration. The habits of the person, things become ingrained, and it becomes a second nature, even though it's still not the mahut, it's still not who they are, it's where they are, but that habit is something which has to be looked at, and the domicile, whether it's a rural situation where they're living or an urban situation, what type of an environment it is, and the effect the environment has on the pupil, take that all into consideration. I must say that all of these four are not value judgments. He's not saying that being poor is something good or bad, and being rich is something good or bad. For example, I'll give you an example of the poor and the rich, and the way I teach it. There's a story of one of the Chabad Rebbes, the fifth Rebbe. And a poor, simple chassid came to see him, and he had his private audience with the Rebbe. He was in there for approximately 2 minutes. That's the kind of yechidus I would have when I was a bacha, when I was unmarried, and before there was discussion of the situation where I was. Just someone is in the yeshiva, you write, the Rebbe would look at the note, tell you what it was, give you a bracha, and you would walk out backwards, so you shouldn't turn your back on the Rebbe from the Rebbe's room. That was a yechidus that this person had. Right after him, one of the most prominent supporters, a very wealthy man, went in. And while this man was putting on his coat or packing his bags or davening Ma'ariv, maybe he was just, he lingered there a few minutes, and he saw this very wealthy man walk in, and it was 5 minutes later. He's not out yet. Wow, he must be double a chassid like I am. 10 minutes, he decided to wait. He waited a half hour, an hour and a half. 2 hours after he entered, this man walked out of the Rebbe's room. So the first chassid, the poor one, went to the Rebbe's attendant, the secretary, who gives the permission. He runs the door. I have to see the Rebbe. He said, you were just there a couple of hours ago. He says, I got a new problem. I have to see him for something else. So the attendant says, a problem that arose in the last 2 hours? He said, yes. He said, okay, then I'll let you go in. And he walks in, and the Rebbe says, what are you doing here again? Good evening. So he said, Rebbe, this is one room on earth. Hasidim call the Rebbe's room Gan Eden, Garden of Eden, the Holy of Holies. This is one room where I thought that money doesn't talk. And the Rebbe says, what makes you think otherwise? He said, I walked in here, and I get 2 minutes of your time, and in walks the big multimillionaire, and he gets 2 hours of your time. And the Rebbe smiled. He says, I'll explain it to you. He says, Du weißt, was dir fehlt. He told him in Yiddish. He said, you know what you're lacking. I know what you're lacking. I give you a minute's guidance, and I give you a blessing, and you're okay. He said, it took me 2 hours to convince that man that he's lacking something. I had to teach him that he's poor. So poor and rich is not it's not a value judgment, and it's not a statement. And the Rebbe does say it explicitly. He says, the self-esteem element of the wealthy person, he said, that is necessary. It's a human quality that makes a human being unique, that he has self-esteem. And that is the quality of the rich person, which sometimes expresses itself in a perverted way as arrogance or as some other sort of thing. I give the girls the example of someone like George Rohr or David Slager, two prominent supporters of Chabad activities, including on campus, both in this country and in the UK. I said, every time we meet with them, they are like humble people saying, thank you for the opportunity to be able to be a partner in that important work. So it's not rich and poor. The rich person tends to have good self-esteem, promote it with everyone. The poor person tends to be selfless, tend to promote that, but at the same time having the self-esteem, having the combination. And similarly with all of these, but taking the keli, the vessel, where the person is at, into consideration. I'll tell you something, another thing about the Rebbe, including in our school, but it's in maybe 5 or 10 places in the volumes of the Rebbe's letters, situations where a pupil was impossible. And the directorate of the school wanted to expel a pupil because of gross misbehavior. And in every single case that I have ever seen of the Rebbe answering that question, in every case, he gave a similar answer with 2 parts. Number 1, he said, the rule is in the halacha, yachid v'rabim, halacha kerabim. The needs of the individual versus the needs of the community takes precedence. In other words, you would be forgiven if you had no other way other than to expel the person. But number 2, every time he said, however, instead of expelling, try to empower that difficult pupil. Find the hidden talent that they have, make them into a leader. And if they become a leader, they will be the one that will become your star pupils. And we know many cases, including in England, pupils who were lucky to have a good teacher and a good head of the school, and they took them in and they found something on their level. They didn't ask them to do something which was beyond them, like they had a camp out or a weekend away, a Shabbaton, and they said, you're in charge of the food. And that pupil became interested in the kashrut, and he became interested in how we can get it. And once they felt that part of it, one of the reasons, the sociologists say that one of the reasons for alienation on big housing estates and things is because the people don't feel in any way that they are part of the whole society. So one has to look for the positive aspects in every person. Chapter 13 is coming to the radiance, perhaps. Chapter 13 is page 66 through 69. It tells us that the student should have 3 qualities to the teacher. They should admire the teacher, should trust the teacher, and respect or obey what the teacher tells them to do. The teacher, and the way I read it, the key to number 1, to earning the pupil's admiration, trust, and obedience is how the teacher approaches the pupil. And the teacher should have a keen awareness as to where exactly that pupil is, to know the details of the development of that child, to have love for that child, that everything that they do is being done out of love, and to constantly review the student's development, to see it as a process and how the student is developing. That will bring that. That's chapter 13. And chapter 14, which is page 70 through 73, is that education must be firm and consistent. It must be delivered with love. And this fosters respect and acceptance of the guidance. Before I go into the details of this, the way I read this, a person might feel if we're so child-centered in our education, we might lose the message. This has been through generations of Jewish education. To what extent should we compromise? To what extent should we have lower expectations? Because otherwise, in today's generation, the kids are so distracted by so many other things. To what extent can we get them to be motivated? And to what extent can we get them to be dedicated to the values and to the character development which runs against the grain of so many people that they see around them? And I believe that this chapter 14 is the answer, a nucleus of the answer. There has to be consistency. There's no compromise in what you want to say. And the student will admire that firmness, A, that's their admiration. B, because they know, they trust the teacher for their love the love of the teacher. They understand that it's coming out of a feeling of love, and therefore they're able to trust, and they will obey, they will respect the teacher. The teacher is a role model of consistency in their own personal behavior. And generally speaking, we're talking about education on the terms of the recipient, of the receptacle, of the vessel, of the keli, of the pupil. It's on the pupil's terms, but it doesn't compromise the light at all. It doesn't say you can expect less. It says take into consideration everything we said between chapters 3 and 13 and deliver it in that way, and then you are able to create pupils who will not be subject to the slings and arrows of their environment. You'll be able to send them out, and they'll be in a remote place, creating their own community with their family, and their children will feel the same way. I just heard from a shliach just recently. His daughter was 5.5 years old. Think of the cognitive development of the average 5.5-year-old. And they got a letter from a woman who had stayed with them for Shabbat, I think it was Sukkot maybe. And somehow, just before the time of lighting the Shabbos candles, the little girl, the 5.5 years old, was setting up the candles into the candlestick. And she was alone there with a woman who was not particularly observant. And this woman said to and the girl said, "This is my candlestick." And she's putting the candle there in the candlestick. So the woman says, "Wow, you're 5.5. How long have you been doing this?" And the girl says, "We've been doing this for thousands of years." She understood the question. She understood her role in this whole thing. And she was not living in a Hasidic environment. She understood what exactly was happening, is that we are part of a change. She understood the whole thing at that age, and that's how she expressed it in the most innocent, natural way. That's chapter 14. And then we have 15 and 16, which is the importance of prioritizing, really. Kadima ve'ichur in Hebrew. That's from page 74 through page 82. And this might seem like a compromise, because if you talk about prioritizing, what he does is he says, what happens if a pupil has 2 faults? You're not just a teacher, you're an educator, and you're teaching character development and values. So what happens if a person has 2 faults? Which one takes priority? And he says, then you have to assess which is more urgent to correct. And he gives an example, but the point is, he says, if you're trying to make a person change 2 things at once, you are guaranteed, as in guaranteed that neither of them will succeed. They both will not be able to happen, because a person is capable. You're talking about changing a person, not just changing a person's momentary behavior. You want to change it's about internalizing education. That requires working on one thing at a time, and therefore you have to work out which one is more dangerous. And finally, there's chapter 17, which is page 82 to 84, and this speaks about praise and criticism, reward and punishment, and their place in education. It's important to realize that praise, reward are not necessarily external things. I always tell our teachers, and I tell those pupils I'm teaching about education and parenting, the greatest reward you can give a pupil or a child is your approval. If you have fostered and cultivated a relationship, then the greatest reward is your approval, and the greatest disincentive would be they do not want to have your disapproval. There's a story that was told by Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak himself about his own education, and a story that he heard from his teacher. And his teacher said that he was a little boy, and he lived on a farm with his family, and he used to somehow or another, every day when he came back from school in the afternoon, towards the evening, he would do something which he shouldn't have done, which is he would tease the chickens that were running around the farm. He would throw pebbles at them and he liked to see them running away, which is a terrible quality, a lack of mercy on God's creatures. But nobody said anything. One day, his father came home early, and he saw what he was doing. And he said his father called him in, and the father had a big strap, which was customary in those days, going back 150 years ago, more. He had a big strap on the wall. And he never, in those days, you would give a child, you give him with the strap, but you lay down on the bed, and you give him whatever it was. His father never, ever used that strap. He said if he ever misbehaved, his father would just point to the strap, which was hanging on the wall, like pretty high. But this time, his father said, come inside, take down the strap. He took down the strap, and he told him, lie down on the bed, and he gave him one shot on his bottom, on his behind. And if you excuse the expression. And then he went into his father went into his own room. And the boy said, he was then a teacher, this was decades later, he said he could hear noise from his father's room, so he put his ear to the room and he heard his father was sobbing uncontrollably at the fact that he had to do this to his son. And he said to Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, who was his pupil, he said that hearing my father crying at his frustration that I didn't live up to his expectation had a deeper effect on me than that strap and than anything else in the world. So what we really want is to win hearts and minds. That's what education is about. That's what it's talking about. Let me go back now to the beginning. Just I got a few minutes. Give me another 5 minutes. I think that the context, the background, it was written in 1898. Thank you. And it was not coincidental that this treatise was written in 1898, because this was a continuation. What happened, this was written in the summer. In 1897, the fifth Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber, created the Lubavitcher Yeshiva in two sites. One was in the village of Lubavitch itself, and one was in a nearby town, a nearby village. Two branches of the yeshiva. And it was the first time that young people in Lubavitch, that you're talking about teenagers, but probably between 13 and 19, 20, were taught Talmud in a very deep way, but at the same time, they were also introduced to Hasidic and Kabbalistic concepts. This was the first time it was ever done. It was highly revolutionary. It was highly revolutionary that such a thing should even take place. And 9 months later, the yeshiva started after Simchat Torah, or started really before the High Holy Days. But that summer in 1898, it began in October, let's say September, October 1897. In the summer of 1898, the Rebbe and the director of the school was the son, who was 17, 18 years old, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, following his father's guidance. And Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak was called by his father to call the heads of the two branches, and they sat for a conference, similar to this one, I guess, for 2 days. 1 day and most of the second day, going through the names of every pupil and seeing what could we do for them, how have they developed, how have they progressed, and thinking of ways that we can move this forward. And at the end of the 2-day conference, the Rebbe Rashab told the previous Rebbe, those notes that I gave you was part of conversations that we have. I'd like you to elaborate on them and to make them into a treatise which became Klolei Chinuch v'Hadrocha. My own, as I haven't seen explicitly, but if you look at it historically, sociologically, the the late 19th century was a time of ferment. There were tremendous inroads into the young Jewish people. People were leaving the religion. People were bereft of leadership. There were pogroms. There were so many different aspects of the upheaval, the social upheavals of the late 19th and the early 20th century, that Rebbe Rashab, Rabbi Shalom Dovber, saw this, the way I understand it, and he said, we need the yeshiva to produce people, he said explicitly, who will be as at home in deep